Indiana Lawmakers is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by the Indy Chamber, working to unite business and community to maintain a strong economy and quality of life.
Hi, I'm Jon Schwantes. Usually sessions of the General Assembly provide answers. The one that just ended, though, created lots of questions, some of which might not be answered for years, if not decades. That doesn't mean, though, that we can't start asking them. Joining me to discuss the 2025 session are the legislature's caucus leaders. House Speaker Todd Huston, a Fishers Republican, House Minority Leader Phil GiaQuinta, a Fort Wayne Democrat, Senate President Pro Tem Rodric Bray of Martinsville, and Senate Minority Leader Shelli Yoder, a Bloomington Democrat. Thank you all for being here. I know you're still resting, catching up on your sleep, but important and appreciated that you're here. There are a lot of questions coming out of this session, a lot of unknowns, it seems to me. We don't know how aggressive schools will be in asking voters for additional support through referenda. We don't know how local governments will respond to reduced property tax. Will they cut services? Will they take advantage of their new taxing authority in terms of a local income tax? We don't know whether federal funding will stay at its current levels or not. What, coming out of this session, and I'm going to ask each of you this, is the biggest question on your mind? We'll start with you, Todd Huston.
Well, I think, we came in, we want to grow on our success. We continue to, Indiana has been a beacon of success in the Midwest. We wanted to grow on that success. The biggest question is, do we get that accomplished? I think we did, and I think Indiana will continue to grow based on the work that we did over the last 4 months. But that would probably be, our big focus has been making sure Indiana is a leader in the Midwest, a leader nationally in growth and economic development. Create opportunities for families and businesses all across our state, and I think we accomplished that this session.
Didn't hear a question in there. Is there what's left though is unanswered in your mind?
Well,
I mean, the what if?
I think the what if is, are we going to continue to grow at the pace we've grown in the past? I think we've set the table to do that. Hopefully, we continue it.
Let's just go right down the line here.
Well, first, I'll agree completely with the speaker on that. The question that I have to answer your question is simply this: is the economy really the $2 billion cut that we saw with the most recent forecast in April? Is that really the case, or is the economy going to rebound? When that forecast came out, there was a lot of uncertainty, which I think was part of what created that kind of challenging forecast. But I'm more optimistic than that. I think that the economy, especially Indiana's economy, has been healthy for a long time. I think it's robust, and we'll be able to move forward. And so the challenges that forecast sort of implied were on the way. I think that the state of Indiana probably has the opportunity to rebound very quickly from that. And by the end of this coming biennium, I think we'll be able to see lots of progress, lots of growth like we've seen over the last couple of years, and find opportunities for the state to invest again.
A question to your question, though, if I may. Couldn't it get worse? I mean, I just saw a piece that they said there's a 60% chance we will fall into recession.
Yeah, of course it can get worse, and that's why we were responsible with the budget that we passed. We put together a budget that's going to be able to accomplish things that the bare necessities that the state needs to be able to provide, but we also left strong surpluses of over 10% year over each year, first year and second year, plus a structural surplus so that we can adjust if the economy does continue to be challenged.
You dip into the reserves, but still leave a healthy one.
Absolutely.
Shelli Yoder, your question.
I would start off by just pushing back a little bit. Why are we prioritizing at the end of this year corporate handouts and writing checks to millionaire families? I mean, that's the question I am hearing. And
you're talking about universal vouchers,
universal
so that there's
vouchers.
no cap on income for families that want to
If we're going to say
get.
that Indiana is leading in the Midwest, then why are we hearing from reports from Prosperity Indiana that 1 in every 3 Hoosiers are earning less than $15 an hour? Why do we not lead the Midwest when it comes to providing help with childcare expenses to our working families? I think when we have an opportunity at a session to prioritize those that rely on us the most, our kids, working and middle-class families, our aging parents, and instead we focus on culture wars, corporate handouts, and control-obsessed power grabs. That's what we have seen at the end of this session. And we can spin it to say it was responsible, but responsible how? Because I am hearing from working class families all across Indiana who are panicked, who are not benefiting from the chaos that they're feeling. And we had a real opportunity, and we did not rise to the occasion.
And we will give these gentlemen a chance to respond. But before, Phil GiaQuinta, any big question on your mind as we leave the session?
Well, you know, I think we came into session, people would say, well, we don't have the money that we maybe had in prior sessions with federal dollars not being there. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the forecast came out mid-April with the fiasco that's happening in Washington, D.C., you know, wasn't very good. So then it really became, as most budgets are, about priorities. So what are our priorities? You asked about the biggest questions going forward. I've already seen with Fort Wayne Community Schools that they've already started with layoffs with some administrative staff. And the fear there with the budget and with Fort Wayne Community Schools, again, less than 2% increase over each year isn't very good, barely keeping up with inflation. That, yeah, there is a potential for more cuts in not only Fort Wayne Community Schools, but other school districts. So that, to me, is going to be the biggest question is how are our local governments, and not just what we think of, you know, local governments, the things that they have to do to provide services, police, fire, and everything else, but school districts around the state, how are they going to be able to handle the cuts that we've seen or the lack of increase with the budget funding, and of course a property tax issue. I'm
guessing you gentlemen are going to want to weigh in on their questions. Let's start with you, Todd Huston.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, we fully funded Medicaid, the most, making sure we provide health care to the most needy of families. We fully funded DCS, those children being served by the Department of Child Services, Department of Corrections, law enforcement. You know, again, put more money in a tough budget in the K-12 funding. So respectfully, I just totally disagree.
How about the writing, you borrow Shelli Yoder's phrase, writing checks to millionaires?
That's ridiculous. I mean, first of all, we fund students. We don't fund school systems. Second of all, we don't just differentiate between income and a whole host of things, like do we provide law enforcement, do we pave people's roads? So look, we provide an education to students. That's what we do. And we fund students, and where they get their schooling is up to them. And by the way, it's been historically successful. Like, academic results have been successful. So we'll defend that all day long, and then, you know, we continue to make investments in things like housing. An issue we've heard a lot about across the state is how do we provide more housing opportunities for families. You know, we're a growing state. All these things that have been said before, I mean, are, you know, people must not love it because they're leaving states that offer everything that was just mentioned before to come to states like Indiana, where we're the fastest growing state in the Midwest by population. So I'll defend our track record. I'll defend everything we've done. I think we continue to build on that this year.
I want to push back, actually, on the
You push back, I'm going to give Rod Bray a chance to push back on your pushback.
We are successful in every measure. Because 1 year ago, and I know that we're going to hear, oh, but our reading scores are higher. Those measures that we did a year ago haven't even been able to take hold. But last year, we were talking about our reading test scores are at an all-time low. That this year alone, we were talking about math. So how can you say that our outcomes are outperforming when it comes to investing in the majority of schools where Hoosier families send their kids, when our teachers and our students are crying out and our test scores are showing that? I would say that, you know,
well, I think we ranked sixth, I think, nationally in reading, and we did have our highest graduation rate.
Graduation, yes, but I would say that's because our teachers are working hard.
Well, they're doing a fantastic job. But facts are stubborn things. And if you look at the most recent NAEP score, which is adjusted for demographics, we're 5th in the nation. We should all be very, very proud of that.
Standardized test with supposedly apples to
apples. Yeah, well, they do it every 2 years. 7,000 students around Indiana were tested in that regard. And when they adjust that for demographic challenges across the nation, we're number 5. We should be very proud.
So no apologies for the notion of writing checks to millionaires.
Absolutely not.
Then why aren't we actually prioritizing who's doing that work and saying to our teachers, thank you? I know we can say, well, we raised your salary to $45,000, but I know many families can't make ends meet with $45,000 a year salary. And we can do better. We can actually appreciate and prioritize the profession and do better by our kids.
Well, Phil GiaQuinta, you talked about priorities, and it is tough when a week before the end of the session, you're going down a certain path, and then, oh, by the way, tap on the shoulder, you have $2 billion less than you thought you did. So it does call for prioritization. And it's easy to criticize priorities that the supermajorities picked. Where would you have wielded the knife?
Well, for example, and I think this is something that we all supported with regards to health care and the amount of money that we put into the healthcare system a couple of years ago. When we continually talk about...
This was public health.
Public health, yeah.
Historic funding.
Well, Indiana's been just ranked, and there's no doubting that, where our rankings, where Indiana has always been with regards to the health care and well-being of our citizens, very poor. And we as House Democrats have been talking about that for years. And so for the General Assembly to finally step and do $200 and some odd million, that was terrific. And we're starting to see really good results. But then just sort of say, well, no, we can't. We're gonna stop that and lower it to 60 million, whatever the number is.
It was going to go from 200 for the biennium to 80 for the 40 each year.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's really just kind of taking a step backwards, and it takes a long time to recover from that as well. And by the way, good health care is good economic development, and it's really good for our citizens, and it's something that we really should continue to.
The idea that we're taking a step back on public health issue. I mean, we did fund it $225 million in the 23 budget. Part of that was so that they can get infrastructure built up and get that program built up. And now we had to cut some in this budget because we had $2 billion that we had to find somewhere. And so you just don't have the luxury of funding it at the same level. But at the same time, if you look at the money spent by all 92 counties, which embraced and adopted this public health program, in 2024, they'll have 45% of the dollars that they got unspent because they just weren't able to spend it at that point. And so would we have liked to have given them more than $40 million each year? Maybe so, but at the same time, because they didn't use nearly all the funds that they received, this is not really considered a cut. They'll be able to continue to do some really positive things for the public health in the state of Indiana. And when the budget comes around in 2 more years, we'll take another look at that. But when you fully fund education at 2% and 2%, like we did, that's half the budget, and we didn't cut into that at all to find that $2 billion. You're going to have to make some other challenging decisions, and that was part of it.
I'd also note that, counties can, the money goes to counties. Counties are administering the programs. Counties can prioritize it. If they find the need, that's an issue for them, they can find the resources too. But as Senator Bray rightfully noted, we are funding the exact same level that we spent the prior year.
Well, they can't do anything they want with the money because of legislation. Among the various things you passed, there has to be to documented residents of the U.S.
Sure.
for the first time.
Yep.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and very quickly too, Fort Wayne Community Schools was 1.9 and 1.2, so we did not receive 2% each year. Could have done it back in the day when we were in the majority. We were doing 4 and 5% each year, but we also weren't spending up to $900 million over the biennium to send kids to private education.
We need to talk too, real quick, about with regard to the property tax piece and whether local governments really got it, what kind of cut they got. First of all, they didn't get a cut. Overall, they're expanding each year. So if anybody talks about a cut, that's a Washington, D.C. cut, meaning they didn't get as much as they anticipated. The other thing that I think is important for all of us to understand is how local government funding compares to the state funding after this last budget. Local government in the first year their revenue is going to increase by 1.6%. State of Indiana's revenue is going to increase by 0.8%. So we're half of that. And in the second year of the biennium budget, the state of Indiana's budget will increase in revenue by 0.1%. Local governments will increase by 5.1%, so much larger. So we all have to live within our means, but local governments.
That's what LSA says.
Those are the LSA numbers. So we all have to live within our means, but the state of Indiana gave itself a much bigger haircut than it did local government.
Well, as you look at, again, cuts had to be made. If you look at this, though, and you can, cuts are in the eye of the beholder, I suppose, but you look at things like public health, even if it was just reducing it to the level that essentially was tapped by counties. But you look at other programs. There was some eligibility tweaks with child care that might reduce the number of people eligible, low-income individuals. You look at some of the things that were zeroed out altogether, the Women's Commission, the Native Americans Commission. Is there a message to be gleaned from that? Well, let me ask them first.
No, I'm going to take a respond to this because
Well, it's not a ventriloquist act, though. I want to give them a chance to.
But I don't want to brush over the response that we had to thousands of families in Indiana scrambling to not be able to afford childcare. And we were promised by the new administration that that was going to be a priority, that we would end and address the childcare wait list with the vouchers. And the answer that we got was, we're just going to reduce eligibility, so less families will be able to actually access the vouchers. Well, yeah, that will reduce the wait list, but it actually will remove the opportunity for more families to afford childcare. So that's one thing. But the other question that you asked about some of the zeroing out from the Women's Commission to public broadcasting. What we saw in this session at the end was we now closed rural schools, and we're going to probably continue to see that. We closed one rural school. We are seeing more and more rural hospitals having to close, 15 labor and delivery units closed. We are going to see now access to information for our rural communities, which comes from public broadcasting. And those are not just quality of life, that is necessity of life, whether having access to information, access to healthcare, and access to education.
Fair enough. Well said, but I want to get
Yoder's passion for rural
areas
of the state.
I ask the question to you, gentlemen. So, what can people infer? Is there any message here? What can voters conclude, or can they draw any conclusions?
Well, look,
it's just
tough priorities. I mean, we walked in, we known we needed with the budget anyway. We knew before the revenue forecast change, we knew we had to prioritize K-12 education, DCS, Medicaid, and DOC. Most of those are some of the most disenfranchised in our society. And so, that's where our priority was. That did not leave a lot of extra money for anything else. And so we had to make difficult and tough decisions. I appreciate the leadership of Chairman Thompson and Senator Mishler as they did that. And again, I think just like every Hoosier family in this state is, had to tighten their belts. It's okay if government has to do it, both at the state and local level.
So not philosophy-driven, not message-driven, just dollars and cents driven is what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean,
Does that mean then, Senator, that these organizations that have taken cuts, higher ed, for instance, took an earlier 5% cut, now a 5% cut both in operating and in ongoing maintenance, and these other organizations that were zeroed out, does this mean that perhaps when times are better, they can see funding restored?
Well, we do a budget every 2 years, right? We're going to come back in 27 and look at it again, and that's going to be based on the amount of revenue that it looks like we'll get over the next 2 years. So yeah, every time we do that, we try to look at the right investment for the state of Indiana. But challenges are out there. This April forecast was a huge challenge because it showed a decrease in revenue of $2 billion, and we had to do what was fiscally responsible. Sometimes that means very challenging decisions, but the speaker very accurately said we invested in things that are going to help the most disenfranchised with regard to DCS and the Department of Corrections. And those programs took up all the excess money that we had, and so that's what the budget ended up looking like.
And you did increase the revenue from cigarette tax, $800 million for Medicaid, cut IEDC, the Economic Development Commission, which certainly isn't the lower socioeconomic
and across the board, including the General Assembly, the Senate, and the House, there was a 5% haircut that every agency got. Some people got more than that.
Some people got 100%.
Some people did, yeah. But but the bottom line, you have to, at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you get a budget that's fair and balanced and has still a structural surplus that gives us a little bit of cushion and a reserve in case the day continues to get worse. And that's what we did.
Decisions were made, messaging over money, because some of these lines were near nothing, but it sends a message. And so the message of sending, we're actually not going to prioritize social emotional learning in our schools. We are not going to prioritize diversity and equity and inclusion in the state of Indiana. As a matter of fact, we're the first state to do what Washington has said to do. Indiana, first state to actually abolish it throughout the state. And I also want to add the decision to zero out the Commission on Women. I think all of those send a very clear message on what we value in Indiana, and we certainly don't value those things.
I'm going to ask you if it's a message, but Phil GiaQuinta, what's going to come back to haunt, in your estimation, of these cuts and the priority decisions? Will one thing stand out as the folks wishing they had a mulligan?
Well, Look, it was a banner year, again, for private schools, an awesome year for charter schools, because they get to now share in property tax revenue when a referendum is put on the ballot and passed. So did well. I think they increased the $1,400 a student dollars per student for charter schools. So they did very well. And it's always interesting to me that that we like to talk about being efficient, but we've got voucher schools, charter schools, virtual. We got so many different school systems going on right now that we're spending a lot of money on, and that's where I've always said I think our priorities are out of whack. You mentioned about 93, 94, 95% of our students that go to public schools are just not seeing the funding that they should be seeing. And I would disagree, though, also that we really, I don't believe, are seeing or getting the results that we should be, frankly, from the charter schools in this state.
Right now, vouchers go to only schools that are less than 10% of students go to these schools, and that's proponents of the voucher say we're talking about a relatively small number. But what prevents this from going to 90%, flipping and saying 100% of students want vouchers? I mean, there's nothing to block that.
Because no, and I would just note, I think we're going to spend the same amount of money probably anyway. It's just, I think where the focus of this conversation is, do you invest in systems, or do you invest in students? Do you invest in systems, or do you invest in families? And where does a family get to choose where they think is the best place for their child to be educated? And
just to be clear, though, no circuit breakers on the demolition of public schools as we know them. If, in fact, 100% of students wanted to go to voucher, you're saying that's fine?
John, I don't think that's ever going to be possible.
It probably isn't from capacity. You're a former school board member.
I'm a former school board member. As you know, the public schools, the public charter schools, they get local property tax dollars. Private schools, voucher schools don't. So that's a big advantage for those. And I support all schools. I support all great schools. And again, I would just note that the academic success that we're seeing is terrific. And for all those people pushing back against it, I just continue to ask: Are you worried about where the money's going, or are you worried about the outcomes? I feel like it's more about the first.
Transparency and accountability, and we simply don't have that with our private school education. What we're hearing is we are basing decision making on that's never going to happen. And what we are hearing again and again is what we thought would never happen is happening. And I think Hoosiers deserve to have some accountability and transparency on how their taxpayer dollars are being spent.
I'm going to leave budget cuts, but I don't want to leave education altogether. In the 11th hour, a lot of decisions were made and a lot of things were introduced, reforms that weren't vetted through the traditional hearing process, including the governance of our state universities, particularly IU will undergo some changes now that the governor will appoint all 9 trustees as opposed to having 3 of them elected. Phil GiaQuinta, how troubling is the prima facie changes or the manner in which they took place?
Yeah, putting it in the budget so there was no vetting, if you will, going through committee or anything like that. I think the system, I've never heard any complaints about the current system that we have, should have just left it alone. The governor has a majority of the appointments, anyway. And so I do think, I like the idea of the 3 appointments that come from the alumni to keep, maybe, you put someone on there that is going to ask some more difficult questions than maybe an appointee of the governor. And so I think it's worked very well. I don't think there was any reason to change it. Not really sure what brought about the change. I guess we'll never know since there was no public testimony on that. So it's going to cause some, I think, hard feelings among IU alumni. There's quite a few of them around the state. So.
Some at this table, or on this couch. In addition, of course, to IU and the selection process for trustees, it changes faculty governance at IU, makes it a recommendation, not a binding type of thing in terms of faculty input, and changes the tenure process a little bit in terms of productivity reviews and so forth. Todd Huston, why so important that this needed to come at the 11th hour?
Couldn't be more critical. First of all, when we're asking them to do more with less, we need to give them the tools to be able to do it. I don't think asking for tenure review, I don't think asking for people to justify every 5 years, John, every 5 years, what they're doing, I don't think that's too much to ask. I also think making sure that the programs are being reviewed. We have programs that currently don't even have students that have graduated in that major for multiple years. They're continuing being offered. So we need to give the flexibility to the universities to be able to address that.
Right, Bray, last question. We're out of time. Whose idea was this?
So I think it's a culmination of lots of people who care about higher education in the state of Indiana. Want to make sure
Pam
it's
Whitten was we've heard reporting that the president of IU currently
it's
pushed
not.
this.
It was a lot. I mean, everybody in this panel right now are IU graduates. A lot of people care about the higher education system in the state of Indiana. With regard to that education, there's 790,000 IU alumni in the world. Under 20,000 of them were voting in this election. So it's not an election that was considered effective or a cross-section of IU alumni. And no other university in the state of Indiana selects any trustees that way. And so this was a way to try and right-size it.
I've seen some municipal primary elections where in Indiana where turnout's 5%. So be careful
going down
that.
More of a power-obsessed power grab, just control-obsessed power grab. That's really what this was about. If it wasn't, we would have had this conversation earlier and not slipped in literally in the darkness of night in that budget.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Lots of energy at this table, obviously. Thank you for being here. Again, my guests have been House Speaker Todd Huston, a Fishers Republican, House Minority Leader Phil GiaQuinta, a Fort Wayne Democrat, Senate President Pro Tem Rod Bray of Martinsville, and Senate Minority Leader Shelli Yoder, a Bloomington Democrat. Time now for our weekly conversation with the Indiana Lawmakers analyst Ed Feigenbaum, publisher of the newsletter Indiana Legislative Insight, part of Hannah News Service. Let's hear your assessment, Ed. Crazy session.
Where do we start, John? I think that this was very interesting because for once we didn't see leadership really dictate the outcomes. And I talked about this really early on in the session, the phenomenon that we were seeing where the leaders were kind of letting things come through organically. We saw that with the healthcare legislation. We saw that with transportation funding. We saw that with a few other things this year too, and that was a big difference from the past, and I think kind of a rewarding thing to see after a while.
Although there were abortion bills introduced but not heard, I mean, that's just committee chair's discretion, I suppose.
There were some of those social conservative and what the Democrats would call wedge issues that did come up, bringing in some of the DC agenda here. But unlike the last few sessions, we didn't see 12-hour committee hearings, and we didn't see some of these issues essentially suck all the oxygen out of the chamber and leave little time and cause a partisan divide like we did in the last couple of years.
One thing I couldn't help but notice when I looked at the cuts, you had Indiana Economic Development Commission, which had been a favorite project of the previous governor, I should say. You had public health funding. You had the Next Level Trails project and funding, several $100 million. Again, near and dear to Eric Holcomb's heart, fellow Republican. How much of this was a repudiation of his legacy or some attempt to dismantle or draw a distinction between the two?
Well, there's a new sheriff in town, John, and I think when Senator Braun was running for governor, he indicated that he had some real issues with the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, and he had some other priorities, and I think you're seeing some of those things laid out right now, and you're seeing some of that in legislation and more of it in executive orders.
Ed, thanks for your insight today and throughout the session.
Thank you, John.
Well, that concludes another edition and another season of Indiana Lawmakers, the state's longest-running public affairs show. I'm Jon Schwantes, and on behalf of analyst Ed Feigenbaum and a lot of extremely talented and dedicated professionals here at WFYI Public Media, I thank you for joining us, and I invite you to visit WFYI.org for more State House news. Until next year, take care.
Indiana Lawmakers is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by the Indy Chamber, working to unite business and community to maintain a strong economy and quality of life.